Hello everybody and welcome along to a brand new video where today I'm continuing my classic Doctor Who reviews. We're still working our way through the second Doctor, and today it's the fantasy fairy tale adventure, The Mine Robber. So yes, this is probably a Doctor Who story unlike any Doctor Who story I've ever really watched, because it is just very, very different to anything else around this part of the era of Doctor Who and just Doctor Who in general. It's completely fairy tale and fantasy and ridiculous and silly and probably a bit more almost for children than some of the other ones of this time. And it's a nice change up, but as I say, it is just something very, very unusual. So yes, this centres around this bizarre land of fiction that the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe get trapped in, where everything around them is basically fictional. It's fictional characters and everything is being controlled by the Master, not the Master, but the Master. And they have to somehow escape out of this land of fiction. And it's all just a bit bizarre and very, very weird what's going on. Of course, the first episode of this story is very much an additional one-off add-on that had to be done because the story before it, The Dominators, was meant to be 6 episodes. It just was a terrible story and they could not even think about stretching it to 6 episodes. This story is only meant to be a 4-part story, so there's a gap in the middle of a single episode, which they had to try and fill somehow. So Derek Sherman, the script editor, jumped in and managed to write per first part for this story that managed to slot in before the main bulk of the story. But they had no money, no budget for sets or actors or anything. So as we saw in this first part of this story, it's literally just Jamie, the Doctor and Zoe in the TARDIS and in some massive white space, and that's it, and a few robots that turn up later in the story as well. So given the constraints they had on particularly that first part, it's amazing how effective it works as a single part sort of introductory to the story. Of course, it's all, again, very weird and bizarre, and you're not quite sure what's going on because it's sort of the Doctor's getting his mind taken over and controlled, and Jamie and Zoe have been led out into this mysterious whiteness where there's just nothing needs to be real or fake, or there's nothingness, and it's just all a little bit confusing exactly what's going on, but it does kind of leave you very, very intrigued. And then the blooming TARDIS blowing up at the end of the episode and just disintegrating into a million pieces, and then suddenly goodness knows where they've gone, it's a great way to end, to sort of introduce the story and get it started with an episode that was never even meant to be written. I'm sure the beginning of episode 2 had been changed because of this first part being written, but definitely this first part would never really have happened. But I think it just massively enhances the story and really gets you straight into what on earth is going on. And then yes, for the rest of the story, they're trapped on this land of fiction and exploring these very different places and meeting these various fictional characters like Gulliver and Rapunzel and just various different ones like that throughout. And also this rather comical sort of fictional character that's fictional to Zoe, not fictional to us, the Carcass, this massive sort of generic superhero type villain thing that turns up and then is overpowered by Zoe quite hilariously in a long fight scene in episode 4, I think it is. But it just adds another bizarre element into the story where you've got a red coat as well turning up to shoot Jamie, because of course Jamie ends up, Fraser Hines ends up missing an episode due to chickenpox in real life, but they had to quickly at the last minute write in him getting frozen and his face, creating the game with putting his face back together and everything. And it's a very, very, very ingenious way to get around not be able to use your main actor for a week, to be able to just literally slot another actor in playing that role. In basically only this story could you actually make that work. Like any other story where it's more serious and more scientific or whatever, you couldn't do it. But in the land of fiction, all the limits are off. You can literally do anything with this story, which I think is so brilliant because it is all about using your imagination, the idea of fiction, and sort of really identifying with children as well and children's imagination, giving them fictional characters they recognise, but this limitless imaginary world sort of thing that the Doctor and the companions get trapped into, which I think is just a really, really clever idea. And really does create quite a great story, I think. Of course, towards the end of the story, the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe finally meet the magical Master, who's been pulling all the strings behind the scenes with this, being able to just write fiction and make it happen and make these characters appear and all these wacky, spectacular things that we've seen throughout this story. And it's in some ways a little bit of an odd resolution or an odd explanation, because so there's this magical brain that's being controlled by this dude who's been kidnapped from Earth and is a writer and loves writing and is being controlled by the brain. But all they seem to be doing is just maintaining this land of fiction because they want to maintain this land of fiction. There's not really any reason or purpose for this land of fiction being there. It just is, and needs something else to maintain it, which is the Doctor ultimately that they want to put into there, because he's beaten all the tests that he's been put throughout the episodes, which is the whole idea behind it. Presumably somehow this intelligence has managed to detect that the Doctor in his TARDIS has been able to find him and detect that he's quite clever and he might be able to be a replacement for this person being used for the master who's being used at the moment. And so in that regard, it's quite a clever idea, but I don't quite understand why this realm needs to be maintained. I guess it's just this brain loves this realm and wants to keep the land of fiction going, I guess, but there's not really any other purpose to it as far as I can tell. But overall, this story really is just kind of wacky. It's quite fun, but just completely bonkers, and as I say, nothing unlike anything else we've had in the show. I think it does work quite effectively for that reason, because it is just something different, and it's very sort of interesting because you get to the point where you realise that literally anything can happen and anything can turn up in this story, because it is a land of fiction where any fictional character or anything could be brought into it and created and be used and everything like that. So I think that's a really kind of interesting way of bringing it in. Of course, I've read the sort of fan theories that hint that it could be that this story all happened inside the Doctor's mind. I think because we see him sat in his chair and then he starts sort of having a funny moment in episode 1. And I think at the beginning of the invasion, the next story, we also see him back in that position in that chair having a funny moment. So I think I remember reading that just the possibility that you could theorise that this is all only happened in the Doctor's mind, which would make sense because the land of fiction doesn't make any sense scientifically and logically. They're in another sort of dimension, I think, is the idea behind it, so anything is possible in that regard, but you look at it scientifically, it's not a possibility, and so it can make sense that it's inside the Doctor's mind. I kind of quite like that idea, but it's also interesting to imagine there is actually a dimension with this actual land of fiction. And so overall, it's not really a story that I'm blown away by. It's nice to have something a bit of a change. It does very much zip along. I mean, a lot of that is down to having such short episodes. I think this story has 3 or 4 of the shortest episodes of Classic Who. It does have the shortest episode of Classic Who, I think, which is only about 18 or 17 minutes, which is really, really short. I'd be interested to know if they tried to put an 18-minute episode into a 25-minute slot on TV, or whether they cut the slot to 20 minutes for that week, because that without adverts, having an 18-minute episode in a 25-minute slot on TV doesn't really work. So if you guys somehow know what they did around that, I'd love to know, because I'd be really, really interested to understand a bit more about that. But it is very noticeable in this story as to how very condensed the episodes are. Clearly there just wasn't that much story to be able to tell throughout, to be able to stretch it over 4 parts. It had a different writer to any other episode, Peter Ling, who hadn't done any Doctor, who hadn't done any sci-fi before. And that's, I think, why this story became very much more fantasy and fiction than sci-fi, because that's where this writer Peter's strength was. So that's why it sort of went that way. But it does feel like maybe his scripts weren't quite as long as they ideally wanted them to be, because I think, as I say, every single episode feels a little bit shortened. And I was a little bit surprised, because I knew this was a 5-part story, but then I was a bit surprised to see the runtime and realise it's only 1 hour and 39 minutes, which is the same length as pretty much every other 4-part story. So pretty much over the 5 episodes we've lost an episode, and so it's the same length as a 4-parter, just it's got an extra episode sort of squashed in there to try to break it up a bit more. So yeah, clearly this was a bit of a story of trying to just stretch it out over 5 weeks, when really it's only an optimistically 4-part story. But I still think it works despite that. I think it just means it does zip along quite nicely. As I say, there's lots of cliffhangers, which do generally work quite effectively. There are a few moments where you're kind of like, when you've got various characters saying, oh, but I think this is real, I don't think this is fiction. It's kind of like, come on, you've seen 4 or 5 separate things in this world already that have been fiction. Come on, Zoe, you're a smart woman. Why are you saying that the Medusa is actually real and there and about to kill you? It's like, I just feel like it gets to that point where you just need to, they really should more think logically and think, we've seen so many times that everything is not real, so just say it's not real and it will disappear by magic. That's how it works. So yeah, I was just kind of, by sort of the episode 4 or 5, I was a bit, come on guys, this is a little bit silly now. But of course, it's children's TV, I completely understand it. And for me, it didn't particularly detract from what was a very enjoyable story. Not the greatest story ever, but I did really enjoy it. I enjoyed it more than I was expecting, because obviously I knew about the whole land of fiction idea, and that didn't really sound quite my cup of tea. I'm much more of a sci-fi fan than sort of fantasy and adventure and that sort of stuff. That's not really so much my kind of thing. So I was pleasantly surprised to say I was really enjoying it. And I think I was also kind of surprised with there being a bit more of a sci-fi aspect with this whole master and this brain and all that sort of stuff and robots in it and everything like that. I wasn't quite expecting so much of that in this story. So I think that was kind of a pleasant surprise and made it a really enjoyable story. So guys, I want to hear from you. What did you think of The Mind Robber? You might have not watched it for years. You might have watched it last week. That's the great thing about Classic Doctor Who, is we can watch it all at any single time. So if you have watched it, and then do let me know what you thought of it down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions and theories on it all being the Doctor's imagination, or if you can somehow draw up a canon explanation as to the Master in this story being the Time Lord the Master. I'm sure somebody has done it somewhere, but if you know what it is, let me know down in the comments below. But other than that, guys, remember to hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you again very soon for another one. Goodbye.